Thank you very much, and thank you for such a warm introduction. It's so good to see so many people here, especially on a night as dreek as it is tonight. So thank you for fighting through the mist and the rain. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite. I know you're such an active group and with such a keen interest, including the medieval period. So tonight I really want to share our project, the end of a project that's been running for a couple of years now. That looks at these things that we call lordly centres. We'll get into the detail of these in a second, but they're quite kind of slippery archaeologically. They're not very well understood. The fact that they don't have a kind of consistent name sort of alludes to that. But I don't actually want to start this talk with archaeology at all, but I want to start with a bit of etymology instead. And the etymology of the word rich. Now, I'm sure we're all pretty comfortable with defining what rich means in a modern sense. But rich is a very interesting word when we think about the medieval period, because it didn't gain its kind of modern sense until the middle of the 10th century. We can define this really quite clearly. Before that point, in the earlier medieval period, in the Anglo-Saxon period, rich meant powerful. It was synonymous with just power. But throughout the course of the 10th century, we see rich gaining its kind of modern sense, conspicuous wealth. Almost that power had become being wealthy. And what that word and its kind of evolution across the 10th century tells us is that actually this is a group of people emerging. Suddenly the kind of nouveau riche, the conspicuously wealthy, are a class of elite that we see emerging throughout Europe around this time, around the year 1000 AD. They are more diverse than they were previously. Now, in the past, power was really based, especially in Anglo-Saxon England, on your family and who you were related to. The kind of coming of the rich in the 10th century sort of breaks that down. It's about how much power you have through your wealth, and importantly, how you show your wealth, how you kind of demonstrate it to your others. Your power comes from kind of showing other people that you're wealthy. So, what does that all mean? Well, it's actually looking at these things that we call lordly centres around this time, around the year 1000, in England, but also across a lot of Western Europe. These rich people start to build these centres in the rural landscape. And our project was looking at these poorly understood sites. A lot of the time, these sites are a big residence with a hall and other domestic buildings, and a church built sort of adjacent to it. And so our project is really examining that on a national scale across England for a couple of years. For the first time, no one's done this before, and really looking at the archaeology of the rich and these particular lordly centres. I should start by stressing that our project was a kind of a collaborative effort. It wasn't just me. It was I led it. I was the principal investigator, but the co-investigator was Oliver Crichton, who brought the kind of castle-y side. And then lots of other people chipping in as well with very important work. It was also a collaboration between Newcastle, where I'm based, and the University of Exeter as well, where Ollie is, but also importantly the Portable Antiquities Scheme. I'm sure many of you are aware of the British Museum-based PAS. So we weren't just looking at the kind of the landscape scale evidence for these lordly centres, but we're looking at some of the kind of the portable material culture as well as an important strand in our work. Now, all of this, you'll be delighted to hear, started in Yorkshire. The idea for the project really was rooted a few years ago, well before the pandemic, in a site that I looked at, a place called Laughton and Lamorthen. I'm afraid this is in West Yorkshire, not up here, but it's an interesting site nonetheless. And really the work we did at Laughton got me thinking about the potential for something much broader. You'll be able to see on the screen there, it's a beautiful drone shot of Laughton and its church. And if you know the site, it's not far from Rotherham. And if you're driving down the M1, the spire is very distinctive when you drive past Rotherham, so look out for it. But you'll be able to see in the foreground there a very sort of prominent motte. I'm going to try and use the red pointer. Here we go, James Bond. There we go. So that's the motte. And this is a very sort of substantial bailey. You can't really see because the earthwork's actually obscured by this tree line here. But this is a very well preserved, very nicely preserved motte and bailey in the property of Mark and his poor family, who we subjected to numerous phases of archaeological fieldwork. But yeah, very nicely preserved bailey. and motte in their back garden. Now, what brought me to Laughton while I was interested in it is that in the Domesday Book, it says that Earl Edwin of Mercia, who is a big Anglo-Saxon cheese, he is actually the brother-in-law of Harold Godwinson, who loses the arrow in the eye at Hastings, and he's a leading noble in the early medieval period. The Domesday Book that says that Earl Edwin had an aula here, a hall. Now, there's lots of debate as to what that means. Does it literally mean that somebody's got a hall literally located in the place name it's referring to? Does it just mean it's their principal kind of seat, their principal holding? But for many years, people have suggested that somewhere, probably underneath the castle, we have an earlier Anglo-Saxon high-status residence, one of these lordly centres. So I thought, why don't we try and find out? There are other hints beyond Domesday Book that there is something earlier going on. In that lovely sort of church spire, which is 13th century and later, we have a bit of an early medieval doorway. So this is clearly pre-conquest, probably late 10th, 11th century. So again, an indicator that even though this is probably reset, we might have an earlier building on site. But also excavations elsewhere in the village found substantial Anglo-Saxon remains. So lots of indications that Laughton is an important place, both in and around the castle, but also elsewhere in the village too. So our work, which I should stress was funded by the Castle Studies Trust in 3 different tranches, very generously. First of all, we did some geophysics. We looked at Earth resistance survey. I know you guys are involved with geophysics. Many of you will be familiar with that. And you can see some of the results of that on the left-hand side. Now, that kind of, especially south of the motte and bailey, you can see the earthwork quite nicely there, quite clearly. But that feature A and B on that left-hand image, those are features that look like ditches to us. And it looked like a rectilinear arrangement of ditches. We're very excited about that because a lot of these lordly centres, as we understand them, are sort of defined by these kind of rectangular ditches. In the northern part, in the bailey itself, it looked like there were several buildings. Also the earthworks we did through a drone survey as well, a photogrammetry, sort of backed that up. There's a bit of activity further south of the motte, but also further north in the bailey. The next tranche of work we tried to sort of, assess whether what we were seeing in the geophysics was a reality. And sure enough, we found, just south, I should say, of the castle, putting a trench across here. I should stress that Mark really didn't know what 15 metres looked like. When I said, can I dig a 15-metre hole in your garden? He's like, yeah, sure. And then suddenly, we had to get the tape measure out to say we've not overcut this. So we kind of put a slot across here trying to get a sense of what this was. It's quite frustrating, and this is quite typical of many parts of Yorkshire in the early medieval period. No dating evidence. There was no pottery that came out of the ditch. And actually the entire fill was really consistent, really sandy. It looked like it had been infilled in one fail sweep. Then actually, whatever this thing was, and it seemed to extend underneath the castle, and that's very important, had been infilled. We're pretty sure, we can't be definite, but we're pretty sure that this is the encircling ditch of Earl Edwin's hall, his high-status hall, and his domestic buildings. And the church, we also assessed that. Michael Shapland had a look at that. It's a little bit conjectural, but it's probable that adjacent to this sort of high-status residence, Edwin had probably a freestanding, what we call a tower nave church. So a very small sort of footprint, not for kind of public use, but for private use. So we get a lot of early Anglo-Saxon churches not being kind of communal buildings in any sense of the word, but actually just being for the family. So we had this kind of binary setup where we've got a high-status residence defined by a hall and encircled by a big bank and ditch, and then next to it, adjacent to it, a private sort of church for the elite family to use for themselves. We had these reconstructions undertaken as well. And I think what's really interesting here is not just obviously finding, I think, Edwin's hall and aula, as it's known, but actually the castle phase as well. So that's the reconstruction we had commissioned by Pig Hill Illustration. You can see the grand hall towards the centre there, probably quite a substantial yard. We probably dug across somewhere further south, probably down here somewhere. It's hard to tell. But these things are quite substantial. The excavated versions of these have a lot of spare room. It's not just sort of a hole in a small enclosure, but actually quite substantial yards and paddocks as well. And of course, the church standing adjacent. Now, if I press this magic thing, you keep your eyes on the screen, you should see the sort of second reconstruction. And this is what we think happened at the conquest. That the church is essentially retained. It gets redeveloped in the 12th century, but we're relatively sure that sometime around the conquest, dating is difficult, but around then, that the Motte and Bailey was constructed on top of this lordly centre. So Laughton in itself we found quite interesting, but we thought there's huge potential here. There's huge potential to look at these sites across a broad time period, to not just look at the castles that often precede these sites, but actually look at the sites that don't become castles, that have an earlier history, that have a different trajectory, and kind of going beyond the kind of sort of castle-like focus that's been, of primary interest to medieval archaeologists. So that's the real genesis of the project. So what do we set out to do? Well, really, trying to get a better grip on these things than we have done previously. Now, we've got several sort of excavated examples of lordly centres, but these are few and far between. So what we tried to do is really get a landscape view, but also get a national view as well. We call these places lordly centres. They don't have a consistent term. When you read about these places, they sometimes get called thainly sites. They sometimes get called castles if they become castles. But we kind of use the term lordly centre because it's a bit of a catch-all and it's not sort of restricted by chronology or character. These are really sort of important places. Many of them actually develop into later manor houses and later sort of manorial residences, and some are castles later as well. They can be sort of foci of administration as well. These are often places where the rural economy is organised, where social control is exerted. And as I said, these are really commonplace that you will, when I'm talking about them now, you're probably even now thinking, oh yeah, that place there, it's not really a castle, but actually is it a manor site? I'm not really sure. They're pretty much everywhere. It's almost like one per parish. But, they don't have a consistent name. So part of our sort of raison d'etre is to try and understand these in a broader sense and a national sense as well. So what we did, we worked a different number of scales, lots of different scales, starting with the big stuff, looking at the national picture, trying to sort of map national data sets. Then kind of scaling down to more sort of focused stuff, looking at a regional scale as well, and then also on a site-by-site basis as well. Before I sort of get stuck into the results of the project, which I'll share in just a second, it's worth emphasising that we were really focusing on places in the countryside and especially looking at places that had both the church and the resident component as well. Many of these lordly centres won't be that kind of situation that we had at Laughton where they're paired together. Often they'll be kind of separated by some distance, or you'll just have a residence or just a church. But as far as we understand them, many of them kind of are coupled together. It's where the elite were showing off their piety through the building of churches, but also they're kind of like their secular power and wealth as well. Places like Raunds-Fernals in Northamptonshire and West Cotton were really well known. Often, a bit like Laughton, a complex of buildings, residential buildings, with enclosures around them, sometimes accompanied by a church. And the whole being a real focus here of the display, but also sort of the social life of the elite at this time. But also churches, really interested in trying to get a sense of what were the type of churches being built next to these. Now, many of these, as we see at Laughton, actually become parish churches later. They start off sometimes with a real kind of a private use. The one at Laughton was a tiny, tiny space, compared to this sort of cavernous environment we're in now, and clearly had an element of kind of private use. But then we look at different examples of churches, and they kind of hint sometimes that they have a communal use, even if the buildings themselves are quite modest. Some of you might know Weaverthorpe. I was getting very cold up at Weaverthorpe this afternoon, having a look at the church there on the hillside. What's really distinctive about the church there is that it actually sits across the high status enclosure. Now, that's really unusual. Why have you got an apparently elite building, perhaps for elite use, sitting at the interface between a privately defined space and a public one? And people, including John Blair, have suggested that this might be because in some way these are communal buildings, that actually the wider community are using them, but maybe it's kind of a binary use. Maybe access is controlled at different times. Maybe there's a different sequence going on here. And we also see that at the other site I visited in Harpham in Yorkshire. Same thing as Weaverthorpe. Look, you can see the enclosure. Sorry, I should be using my pointer. I keep forgetting my pointer. This is the earthwork enclosure at Weaverthorpe, and the church sitting right across that kind of interface. And we see that too at Harpham, where apparently this high status enclosure is kind of, again, being cut through by the positioning of the church. So we've got a bit of a kind of dichotomy there, a bit of a paradox, where we have sometimes buildings that look quite private and for private lordly use, seemingly accessible to a wider public. So we sought to explore that as well. Now, before we get stuck into our results, we do need to talk about castles. I like castles, I should put it out there. They're interesting, they're worthy of study. What the project tried to do was include castles in the discussion, but not look at them exclusively. Many times in the kind of the period we're looking at, and I should stress we really put our focus between the sort of the 9th and the 12th century. So we're looking at the very origins of these lordly centres and their earliest evolution. Now, most of the time, the castles that we see in this period are lordly centres themselves, but I think the focus of the castles sometimes, the kind of the reason that the lordly centres of other types have been overlooked. And it's clear that castles are very distinctive. I think this quote you can see at the bottom is really kind of insightful. This is the first time that the word castle's used in England in an English context. And the translation, I'm not going to try any old English, but the translation says, then that year, the foreigners, or the foreign men is the particular term it uses, built a castle in Herefordshire. And it's really interesting that in that passage, the word castle that is used is not an Old English term, but it's also used in the same breath as foreigners. It's seen as something other, it's seen as something distinctive, and castles are distinctive and interesting. What the project sought to do was to look at those as part of a broader whole, understanding castles as a type of lordly centre, but looking at the others too. So I'm not going to hate on castles, but we're trying to go beyond just the focus on particular types of earthwork. So in terms of the project results itself, you'll see lots of maps now, for which I apologise. As I said, we tried to look at lots of different scales to get a handle on what's the sort of distribution of these places, what's their character, can we work out some of their chronology. All of this data that we've gathered now is accessible on the Archaeology Data Service, hosted by the University of York. It's only been made available in the last couple of weeks, actually. But what we were trying to do in this big kind of mapping exercise, which we used a kind of project GIS, was to try and really understand whether we could see any big picture stuff. We incorporated things like the corpus of Romanesque sculpture you can see on the left-hand side there. So all of those dots on that map is going to be churches and sort of sculpture material from 1200 or earlier. It's an amazing resource. If you don't know it or if you've not used it, I really encourage you to use it. It's all done, very much citizen science. This is people using their own expertise and building this database. So they were very kind in sharing their work. But also we mapped things like early castles as well. The picture on the right-hand side you can see there is the distribution of probable and definitely early castles from 1200 and earlier that we developed alongside it. But it wasn't just the sites themselves. As I said, we worked with the Portable Antiquities scheme, trying to map potentially elite accoutrement as well, elite artefacts that have been lost, often metal detected and found again and recorded by the Porter Antiquities Scheme. So we focused our efforts on what might be interpreted as elite looking goods, especially things like horse apparel. Now it's been said actually, it's quite surprising that probably in the 11th century it wasn't actually uncommon to own a horse. It wasn't necessarily exclusively an elite kind of piece of property. However, I think sort of decorating horses, the kind of things that we find falling off horses, was certainly kind of restricted to the top class of society. So we did a lot of mapping on a national scale of that material as well. But what we noticed with all this big national data is that really we're kind of as much looking at patterns of people's previous work, the research history, as we were actually looking at the kind of a reality. So what we realised very quickly was that we needed to sort of burrow down and look in a bit more detail, trying to clean some of this data and understand it a bit better. And for that, we looked at 2 macro regions, and for this we were much more thorough. We went to the historic environment records, we started to look at the details that was recorded for lordly sites here. So here we were sort of mapping churches and high status residences, but also really trying to dig down and see what was the kind of justification for them. We looked at 2 different areas. We looked at a south and western region and a north and eastern. You'll be delighted to hear that Yorkshire was included in the north and eastern region. A number of reasons for this is partly because we wanted a different parts of the country with quite distinct research histories. We also then had clearly an area that was within the Danelaw and one without as well. So we're interested about what was happening, especially in the 10th century, and how things might look quite different in different parts of the country. Even though the southwest sort of macro area has far more counties, the actual area we assessed actually quite similar in terms of pure kind of land area covered. So these were our 2 macro regions that we wanted to explore in much more detail. And what we did and what we were able to do, but through this process of understanding the data a bit better, was actually be able to plot things in a bit more kind of detail. So we were able to sort of understand things in relation to other components of the landscape. So one of the things we actually looked at was settlement density, and this is one of the first big surprising parts of the project, a surprising result, is that we've actually found that lordly centres were far more common in places that were sort of characterised by quite low settlement density, places that are kind of dispersed, so not kind of nucleated villages, but we might sort of understand them, having been part of a seigneurial landscape, but actually quite strung out farmsteads were far more commonly associated with lordly centres. This was true not just of kind of lordly centres that weren't castles, but castles as well. So that was quite a surprise. We mapped it against these kind of these residences and these churches against loads of different things. Roman roads, we thought maybe existing components of the transport network might help dictate locations of these places. Didn't seem to at all. You can see from that distribution map there, this is Somerset and Wiltshire, and actually you get the odd site located close to or on a Roman road, but nothing really kind of compelling. What was far more kind of interesting and I think significant is sort of the quantity of elite sites, these lordly centres that were located close to a watercourse. Okay, that might be pretty obvious, of course, that these are residences, they're high status, they need water, but we think something else might be going on rather than just irrigation and for household use. So you can see here, on the left-hand side, the red dots are places, they're lordly residences that are close to a water course, 250 metres or closer. The white ones are further away. The church is even more compelling. You've got even a greater number of red dots there, suggesting that lots of churches are very, very close to watercourses. Again, it's only through sort of burrowing down to the data to a sort of a more detailed level that we can make more sense of it. This is Wiltshire and Hampshire, and if I take my red dot away, the red dots here are the residential sites. The bluish ones are the ecclesiastical ones, the churches. And you start to see really compelling relationships between these lordly centres and watercourses, and often quite major watercourses as well. So you can see, especially further south, heading towards the channel there, lots and lots of the red dots, these residential sites located, right on top of a watercourse. So what's going on here? Well, I think central to this, as I said, it's not just being close to a river for domestic use or irrigation, but clearly water power and the sort of emergence of water mills around this time is very important. The more we sort of dig down into our sites and look at them and characterize them, this is some of the visuals we produced for the project. Look at how many of these sites are located with water courses defining their enclosures or being built inside. Many of them still have mills today, or had mills right in, to the 18th and 19th century. So we're pretty sure that mills are a really sort of defining feature of these enclosures, and that it's almost like synonymous with the kind of lordly power that we're seeing. And actually, in the excavated examples, again, this is Raun's, the few excavated examples we do have of lordly centres does meet that out at Raun's West Cotton, this site is called, an amazing sequence of mills was actually excavated right next to this lordly centre. So a lot of the time we're not actually looking at medieval mills still standing on the site. We seem to have later ones, but we're pretty sure that underneath them we have got kind of medieval mills being really sort of defining these lordly centres and a key characteristic of them. What was interesting about using the PAS in a bit more detail as well, so this is these artefacts that we're looking at, is that we could actually start to use the metal detected finds to help us find further sites. So here the dots on the map you can see are sort of known lordly centres, and the kind of hotspot effect you can see is a density of horse apparel, so horse equipment. And you can actually see that sometimes we get a lordly centre, for example, up here, nicely located within the hotspot as you imagine. But then actually we get kind of hotspots like this, and this is Lincolnshire, and further over here as well, where it's not a known lordly centre, but there's loads of high status artefacts coming out of it. So actually we can use the PAS data to find these lordly sites, or at least give us an indication of high status activity that we didn't know existed before. So that's really, really useful and interesting. How long have we got left? Okay. What I want to kind of use the rest of the talk for, though, is to look at the kind of the work we've been doing for about half of the project, I would say. And this is where it gets, I think, probably more meaningful, a little bit more interesting, in that we can start to build biographies of places. We can start to look, when we look at these places in real detail and throw all the techniques at it we can, we start to see these places evolve in far more detail. So we looked at 7 different sites in really thorough detail for the project. This involved lots of different work. It involved like the desk-based research, topographic survey, especially using photogrammetry, but also geophysical survey as well. You can see Paul Scott working through a very nettly Gloucestershire field there. But alongside that, because we're very lucky with this project, we're looking at places often that have standing buildings as well as buried archaeology on the site. So we looked at the standing buildings too. And then finally, of course, we did have our PAS analysis as a further component. So, this is where we start to understand places. And I think it's not much of a compelling conclusion, but what you did start to understand is that each of these places has its own biography. We can't write a kind of this is what happens to lordly centres across the 9th and 12th centuries. They're all distinctive. They're all interesting in their own right. And it's actually only through really dedicated research that you can actually begin to understand the place that you're particularly looking at. The first place we looked at in the project, I think, was extremely low-hanging fruit. We've got an article coming out in the next couple of weeks. We're doing a press release for this because I think it will garner, hopefully, quite a lot of public interest, although you're the guinea pigs. If you're not interested, you need to tell me. Because this site we're looked at for the first site of the project as a place called Bosham. It's pronounced Bosham, even though it's spelled Bosham. And it's famous because it's depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry. It's the only lordly centre, I think, that I know of that is depicted with a contemporary illustration. It's the bit earlier in the tapestry, before Harold gets the arrow in the eye, the bit that people aren't as interested in compared to the castles and the battle. But Harold goes to church at Bosham, as you can see on the top, and he also feasts there. So this is Harold's main residence, is at Bosham. It was a primary residence of his father, the Earl Godwin before him. But it just goes to show how poorly understood these sites are, in that nobody's really thought to try and find this site. It's on the Bayeux Tapestry. We thought, well, can we try and find this site at Bosham? We're pretty sure we have, which I think is interesting. Bosham is depicted a bit later, probably. So Harold rides to Bosham. You can see him there with his hunting hawk on his hand on his horse. He's then going to church, then he's departing to Normandy after having his feast. And then it's interesting, when he gets back from Normandy, it could be that this is one of these freestanding tower nave churches. It looks like that this is a lookout, that people are looking for Harold to return, that he is arriving here. Bosham is not actually cited here, it's just probable that he returns to the same place. So in a broader landscape sense, Bosham's are located to the west of Chichester. The very famous Roman villa at Fishbourne is just here, so it's a very busy part of the world archaeologically. But a bit like Laughton, people have always thought that the kind of manorial centre, the lordly residence at Bosham that's on the tapestry, is probably under the current manor house. But not much work has been done to try and demonstrate that. So we undertook a series of detailed surveys, not just looking at the manor house, but the church as well, which has got substantial Anglo-Saxon remains, but also this area on the front. The PAS data was not kind of immediately very compelling, but that didn't really put us off. We then undertook a detailed ground-penetrating radar on these different locations, and the area we're really interested in is the manor house up here. We're very thankful to the owners who let us, strange archaeologists, come into their garden. They gave us access to their house as well. We had free rein. They're very, very generous. But with the kind of aim of trying to find out whether we could determine where Harold Godwinson's residence was. So this, you can see Scott working the GPR at the church, but also down at the manor house itself. It was a glorious day for it. But also on the front, we did some topographic mapping as well. There's clearly some earthworks that haven't been mapped on National Trust land as here. Well, here. Michael, in his socks, you can see, very professional, but I suppose he's being polite in somebody's house. He had a look at the manor house, which was purely thought to be post-medieval in date. No one really looked at it in real detail at all. Again, we tried to understand this more thoroughly. Before we got there, though, it is worth noting that West Sussex Archaeology and George Annalay, who heads that up, had dug up the garden in 2006. Now, the owners of the house at Bosham are very interested in archaeology, and because they thought that the house might be on the site of Harold Godwinson's residence, they put lots of evaluation trenches, not only just through their garden, which is very nice, but also inside the house itself, which feels very drastic, I must say. It's found an awful lot of archaeology, an awful lot of medieval archaeology, which I'll talk about in just a second, but also a huge amount of Roman material. Now, this stuff hasn't seen the light of day because it wasn't under a planning condition. So a grey literature report was written, but was never made publicly available. What we've been trying to do, and hopefully this will come out now, is to make this more sort of publicly accessible, because I think it's really important. Not only did George's work identify lots of very nice early medieval stuff. This is a 7th century strap end, you can see. Huge amounts of Roman material on the site as well. It's interesting, these lordly residences are often built on or close to Roman sites when they're dug. It's notable here that the Roman material we've got, including, you can see some roof tile here, some flooring and some CBM, not one bit of domestic pottery, loads of Roman building material, but no domestic pottery. Now, why might that be? I think it's probably because this material is being brought for reuse on the site. That actually we're not looking at a Roman site at Bosham Manor House, but someone is kind of magpieing this Roman material and reusing it. Otherwise, you should be sort of ankle deep in Samian ware and other high status Roman, pottery, but it's simply not here. So it's really quite interesting. Our work and Michael's work, particularly inside the manor house, as I said, tried to sort of understand the chronology of the house. It was understood as purely an 17th and 18th century building. Yes, it is. But actually, there's much earlier origins. This is a chunking great medieval wall sat in the middle of this very nice house. But also a tie beam. This is from a medieval hall, been reused in a staircase at the back of the house. Likewise, you can see very early medieval, where's my pointer? Very early medieval building material here. There's clearly several phases of medieval buildings inside the manor house. It's almost just been encased by a later building. These are the bits you can see, the blackened beams. When I said they let us go everywhere, they really did. This is their kind of water tank in their attic, which we got up to. Again, blackened beams here. These are reused medieval beams. And here is a lovely little sundial, an early medieval sundial, been rebuilt into the manor house. Sundials are very distinctive of these lordly sites. You seem to find a lot of them. Why you could ever need more than one sundial, I don't really understand. So I went to Harpham today, there's 3. Why do you need 3 sundials? And I just wonder whether it's lordly families investing in the church, and this is a kind of thing that you can, if there's a new lord, that they furnish the church with another sundial. There's one site in Northamptonshire, I think I counted 8 different sundials on the south face of the church. So very, very interesting. So yeah, clearly the manor house itself is much older than we think. It's not tapestry old, boo. It's probably 12th, 13th century, but probably 2 different medieval buildings before the more modern manor houses developed. But there was other elements that were standing too. In the garden itself, there was this ruin that again was thought to be 18th century in origin. We don't think it is. It looks medieval. These kind of lancet windows here, we're pretty sure that those are in situ. People before have thought that this is a bit of a folly, a kind of a creation of the post-medieval period. Michael's pretty sure this is actually a 12th or 13th century building, still standing, the footings of it in the garden. Really interesting. You can actually see the very earliest bit actually lying underneath this sort of flint coursing as well, and that's the key to it. I should stress that Michael didn't do sort of brick by brick assessment of this. We can't be entirely sure, but we're kind of 90% sure that we've got 2 standing medieval buildings at Bosham Manor House. We also found in the archive from the 2006 excavations this really interesting piece of curving masonry, which David Stocker thinks looks like a chimney. Do note the lancet windows as well. They look extremely like ours there. This is the 12th century Norman house at Christ Church in Hampshire, which has a chimney and these 12th century lancet windows. So we think probably the garden ruin may have looked a wee bit like that at one point or another. So interesting, clearly we've got medieval stuff, the kind of medieval elite centre at Bosham to at least the 12th century is there, but can we push it back to the tapestry? So for that we looked at George's work again, and the key thing here, you'll be surprised to hear, was the latrine actually. It's actually the excavation of this building here in 2006 with George's work, was actually this cesspit here. That's really important. It's a funny thing to say, but what that probably shows us is that this is a kind of a timber building, probably a hall, and it seems to have an inbuilt latrine. Why should we get excited about that? Well, it's only in the 10th century and only in very, very high status buildings that we kind of see the ensuite emerging. The Anglo-Saxon ensuite is a phenomenon of the 10th century. So actually, George's work at the time didn't necessarily recognise that, but we're pretty sure that we have a timber building, kind of fragmentary remains of, with a cesspit integrated into it, and a latrine. So we're pretty sure that this must be a very, very high status building, either royal or sub-royal. Essentially, we're pretty sure it must be Harold Godwinson's residence. So, we think that's pretty important, and so that's why we're doing this press release in the next couple of weeks about that. Bosham itself is, developed probably out of a monastery. That in itself is very interesting. But I want to skip on to our next case studies as well. It's also worthwhile, noting that we do have this binary relationship at Bosham. We do have our church down further south and the residence, which is up here. We think probably in the 12th or 13th century, the Lordly Centre actually expands and goes across this kind of ditched enclosure that George picked up in his excavations. So we can't be 100% sure, but we're kind of pretty confident that the famous residence depicted on the tapestry is actually now confirmed as lying underneath the modern manor house. But please don't go to visit. They're very private people, and I don't want people rifling through their bushes looking for Harold or anything else. So. Next case study, I will alight on quite quickly because I want to finish with a Yorkshire case study. I'm sure you all want to hear that as well. This is the other end of the scale in that we knew absolutely nothing really about Saintbury in Gloucestershire. Very little in terms of the written record, certainly not depicted on the Bayeux tapestry. But as you can see from that photo, absolutely amazing earthworks and been recognised by people before, including English Heritage and the National Mapping Project. We were very interested in the church, which is 12th century, but this very interesting sort of curving enclosure here, which seemed to have a cluster of earthworks at its core, which looked like a kind of maybe a high status element, and it built right next to the church. So we kind of threw absolutely everything at this. This is the LiDAR image of that same site. You can see how impressive the earthworks are. It's amazing. Saintbury, it's never been mapped. It's never been mapped by the Ordnance Survey or English Heritage. It's never been scheduled. These earthworks are incredible, but it's just not been picked up. And a little bit like Bosham, if Bosham was a castle, it would have been studied to death, I think. The fact it didn't get turned into a castle is interesting, but it also means it's kind of been ignored. And Saintbury's the same. It's one of these lordly centres, but how do we schedule it? How do we define it? It's not quite a castle, it's kind of something else. And I think that's, again, why it's been overlooked. We looked at the church. The church is firmly dated to about 1100. It was probably a simple sort of plan, a kind of single cell with a chancel. Probably quite a capacious building, for communal use, not like these smaller tower naves. Beautiful Norman architecture, and you'll notice another sundial. Again, really common. Reset. These things are really poorly dated. It's probably pre-conquest and put above the Norman doorway. We can't be sure. There are hints of something earlier going on. This is probably a Sheila na gig here on the left-hand side. It might be an angel. It's been literally defaced. Somebody scratched the eyes and the mouth out. This, very enigmatic. This is a double-headed window, very distinctive sort of Anglo-Saxon architecture. We don't know where this is. There's a reference to, in the 1960s, this being moved to somewhere in the village, but whoever it is hasn't owned up because we can't find it. But this looks certainly pre-1100, so there are hints that there's something earlier going on here. Our photogrammetry, I think, was quite insightful in it. It gave us kind of unprecedented view of the earthworks. So actually, we start to see that this kind of oval enclosure is actually made up of sort of linears instead of, a perfect oval. And look at that complex of, stuff going on in there. We're pretty sure that this is, at some phase, a lordly centre, a residence in there somewhere. And probably, obviously there are a kind of a series of churches underneath the current church. But there's all sorts of other things going on. There's clearly a Roman element on site. Geophysically, loads of results as well. This building's very interesting. It's aligned perfectly with the church. Are we looking at another church, an earlier church? Are we looking, is that the kind of the hall? Is that the residence? But on the other side of the church as well, clearly an enclosure. There look like a series of burials here too. And this is a later windmill, which is rather nice. The PAS in this instance was not massively insightful, but what was more interesting was the work we've done with Tim Kinneard at St Andrews University, and he has dated the site through this technique called optically stimulated luminescence. Won't go into detail, but essentially he's been dating the soil for us, and his results were really interesting. They kind of demonstrated to us that the big enclosure, that oval thing on the outside, was actually probably Iron Age in date. Maybe Romano-British, more likely Iron Age. We actually think the site originated as an Iron Age banjo enclosure, and then it's retained. Tim's work showed us that it was actually retained throughout the whole kind of first millennium AD. Really interesting. So it's probably in use for sort of, at least 1,000 years. It's really quite significant. And really the lordly sort of centre on the site is the very last phase of that. It looks very similar to other sites that we find in the Cotswolds as well, I should stress. Notably at Saintbury, what we don't see, we do have a castle at Saintbury, but it's not on that site. The site I've just been talking about then is up here. But again, this site has not been scheduled, it's not been looked at. We've got this quite interesting earthwork here, which I'm pretty sure is a Motte Bailey. It has been sort of reused and kind of sort of messed around with. It's probably used as a prospect mound a little bit later. But why did they not plonk, the castle on top of the existing lordly centre like they did at Laughton? Well, it might be to do with the kind of the broader sort of geography here. That red line there is the Roman road. What we have here is a landscape defined by meeting places. This is a place where Anglo-Saxons like to meet. It's where three boundaries meet, Gloucestershire, Worcestershire and Warwickshire. And that's a place called the Kiffsgate Stone was the kind of the local 100 meeting place. Further down here, Kiffsgate Court, that seems to be like a royal meeting place. It's a really busy administrative landscape, and it's interesting that the castle is built right next to the Kiffsgate Stone. So whether there's this kind of sense that there's not just overlooking the Roman road, but also overlooking what's going on at the 100 meeting place seems to have defined the castle's position here. It's interesting that we have this landscape of meeting, and it becomes much later the site of the Cotswold Olympic Games, which is sort of a product of the 17th century. But it's interesting that they choose Dover's Hill, which is just here, right by the Kiffsgate Stone. It's been rebirthed, if you like, the Cotswold Olympic Games. So if you want to go shin kicking or welly wanging in May, here's the place. But what's interesting about these sorts of events is that they often perpetuate much older sites of assembly, and we seem to have that at Saintbury. Okay, just to close then, I want to finish with a Yorkshire case study because I thought you'd be interested in this. This is Little Ousburn in North Yorkshire. It's, again, another example of the project. In addition to Laughton, where we found a probable tower nave, these kind of very small tower churches that seem to be sort of privately owned by the late Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. We've got two in Yorkshire, one at Little Ousburn and one at Hornby. So this church is very old, it's very interesting, but it's significant that it's on a much earlier site. It seems to be on the site of an 8th century monastery. We've got lots of sculpture that supports that. The site seems to sit in this really kind of coherent zone, probably a large parish in the 8th century. But also, very interestingly, just released in the last year or so, we know that just up the river, if you like, at Aldwalk, based on metal detector finds, that there's a Viking camp here as well. Our identification of the monastery has come completely separately from that identification of the Viking camp. So we're just wondering whether the Vikings may have been using our probable monastic site as a bit of a farm, really, as they tended to do. We do have a lot of kind of evidence now that Vikings did, base themselves in and around monastic sites, not so much for the gold and the kind of, the Daily Mail headline grabbing stuff, but actually these are farms, these are big estate centres that they can exploit. But what we think is happening at Little Ousburn is that into this earlier monastic site is inserted a lordly centre, again with a residence and a church. It's hard to see, especially at that distance for you guys, but I've drawn it in red there. No one believed me on the project. I could see this. There's one image on Google. I could see this weird ellipsis. Everyone said I was talking rubbish. I was really happy when we found it. Because for about 6 months, people went, there's nothing there. What else kind of supported the idea that it was a lordly centre was not only the actual church tower itself, which looked Anglo-Saxon, but also sculpture. So we had a kind of interruption in the Viking period. We got sculpture from the 8th century. We have a hiatus. Then we have more sculpture in the 10th and 11th century. And I think it's relating to the lordly centre that's developed. Now, I have faith stuff, but our geophysics, which is quite limited, did pick up the enclosure just there, and just the other edge of it here. You had to believe me, I'm afraid. You just have to believe me. So what we think we've got is probably the monastery occupying this whole kind of peninsula, and then the lordly centre kind of inserted at a later date and kind of what we call sort of secularising this earlier centre. So we have, very typical lordly centre setup. We have this enclosure defining the sort of elite space with probably a residence on one side and then the church on the other. We certainly see this being abandoned probably in the 13th century when a moated site is occupied further south of the site. So we've got that sequence again, not dissimilar to Bosham, that we have the monastery and then the lordly centre kind of inserted into it. And it's interesting, this text here seems to allude to the lordly centre as well. It talks about multiple churches and actually a group of resident priests on the site as well. Last site I'll talk about, I promise, is Hornby in Richmondshire, another Yorkshire site, which looked exactly like Little Ousburn in terms of the enclosure itself. We didn't get quite as much of this in terms of development as since sort of knocked a lot of this kind of out, but you can kind of see, if I follow the red pointer here, very similar kind of almost like teardrop-shaped enclosure that we're seeing. We've not really picked these up before in archaeology. These are, I think, kind of a new type of site we're looking at. But just like Little Ousburn, a tower nave, freestanding church, and you can see the big earthwork of the enclosure to the west there as well. And that's what we think it probably looked like. What is remarkable about these sites, and you can see the example of Hornby at the bottom there, they are so consistent in their size. They're about a hectare in size. They're really quite consistent. They sometimes up to 2 hectares, but they're quite limited. They're quite small. Absolutely everything I've spoken about tonight is available, as I said, through the ADS. That has been available for the last few weeks, so please do go and have a look. The stuff to download, so all of the sites I've spoken about, we've done detailed reports on, and the ones I've not included as well. In terms of other outputs, this is going to be linked to the press release. It's not open access yet, but it should have been. And it should be by the end of the week, certainly. So that's in the Antiquaries Journal. That's a kind of more thematic piece. And a little bit more about the project's already been published in Medieval Settlement Research. So to conclude then, I've said quite a lot, and I've witted quite a lot, so I apologise for that, and I really welcome your questions. Poorly understood is how we kind of, conceptualise lordly centres, and they're really sort of hampered by that emphasis on castles. But if we go beyond that kind of obsession with defence and categorisation of what castle type, I think we get a better sense of what these places might have looked like, their character, how they were used. But also we can start to broaden out what these places look like archaeologically in terms of thinking about them as technologies of power. No one's really looked at mills in any detail associated with these sites. No one's looked at sundials. I really want to look at sundials as a project. We can't date these things. There's lots and lots of work to be done. But by sort of throwing the net a bit wider, I think we understand these places more fully. As I said before, ultimately every site is very unique and it requires dedicated studies. There's no sort of big answer to the project, but common traits do emerge. Things like enclosure size, as I mentioned at the end, is a really consistent one. I've witted on. Thank you so much for listening, and welcome any questions. Thank you.
That was very interesting. You're all right having questions?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I wonder if I could just ask one. Was it Saintbury in Gloucestershire?
Saintbury, yeah. It's Wright. It's only just in Gloucestershire, literally on the border. So it's not far from Evesham's, the closest place, or Broadway.
Right.
Broadway. It's probably about 5 miles to the east of Broadway.
Right.
Yeah. So it's very interesting place.
Right.
Yeah. We're hoping to dig it this summer. So. And yeah.
Right. Simon has a roving mic. If anybody's got any questions, if you can put your hand up and he'll walk up to you.
I was just curious about these sites and how they developed over time and how they continued over a period of time. What the law of succession would have been, and what influence it would have had on how these places developed. I mean, presumably they had reasonable sized families. Who inherited it, and where did the rest of them go? Did they go to the attached churches, the monastic institutions? I don't know.
It's a really good question. Mark Gardner's done a bit of work on this, and it's what we might see. We sometimes see divided manors when you got sort of several legitimate heirs. Sometimes we see that, but really good question. And I think what our work necessarily doesn't do is look at the kind of complexity of these places. Are we looking at more than one hall on one site? We shouldn't think of this as one lordly centre with one hall and one family, but actually a far more messy kind of succession, as you say, and an evolution as well. And also, as we shouldn't necessarily think of it as one site in the landscape. These places can get deserted, they move. The fact that we're looking at the sites we've chosen is because they are now accessible for our work. Many of these are still occupied today, as Bosham was, for example. So, it can get very messy, it can get very complicated. Mark Garner's got a very useful sort of paper on that, trying to understand the trajectory of these places and using the documents as well. But essentially, it's very complicated, is the answer.
I guess you've lived to brief this for the last 2 years. In terms of your approach and methodology, is there anything you would do differently in hindsight? And a linked question, where would you look to do further research in the future?
Yeah, really good questions. I mean, part of us, we didn't look at the Midlands, not because we don't like the Midlands. Midlands are amazing, but Midlands have been studied really thoroughly. So a kind of side project that's emerged actually from this, and I kind of very cheekily added this for the questions, is we're looking at, again, a famous site, one that's been studied to death at Earls Barton. So what would we have done differently? Probably look at the Midlands and done a Midlands case study. We didn't have, in terms of, very generously funded, but initially the project was only 18 months, so that's really, quite a short turnaround. So we'd love to have done further work. But we have managed to look at Earls Barton, which is in neither our macro areas, it's in Northamptonshire. It's got this incredible church tower, which is very famous. It's one of these freestanding tower-nave churches. The building has been studied to death for 100 or so years. No one's done any work on the stuff around it. So the big lump next to it, we're not sure if it's a castle or if it's prehistoric or Anglo-Saxon. We've done a fair bit of work as a sort of a bonus ball project, including the GPR and some topo work. I'll just get to what we seem to have found here is quite interesting, is a second church at Earls Barton, about 2 metres from the famous tower. So that tower you can see popping out there that has been studied to death. People have been standing looking at it, and there's another church literally next to that church tower. So we're looking at that in some detail. We've actually got access to, we're not entirely sure if it's a church or a mausoleum, but it is literally there compared to the tower nave. We have got access to some human remains as well from this site, which we're hoping to get funding for to do some isotopic work, as well as date them. We're pretty sure that the earliest graves on site were dug in the 70s, and we're really interested to see if they're Danish or not. So that's the kind of the angle we're going down. We're looking at, just inside the Danelaw here, are we seeing any kind of distinctions between the kind of lordly centres that are established in the Danelaw and not. So that's where the research is going now, but very much as a kind of an addition. But, yeah.
Any more questions?
Do you think these were places where someone lived, or do you think they were centres for justice being dispensed, tithes being collected, taxes being collected as well?
Yeah, really good question. And yes, they were. The understanding of it, and it's very kind of knotty and academic, but the understanding is that sort of pre-conquest, that these places weren't centres where justice was being administered privately. The idea is that kind of the Anglo-Saxon state kind of penetrated into these places, before the conquest, but actually after the conquest, we do see them emerging as, manorial courts and places of private justice. So we kind of lump them all together as lordly centres, but somewhere like Bosham is potentially going to be very different to somewhere like Hornby, for example, where we know that that's probably a lord with a single residence, and that's their residence, and maybe why we see impressive investment there, and maybe it's interesting. We've got almost like a inverse relationship where sometimes the bigger landholders, the richer people, have got less impressive stuff on their sites. And is that because they're kind of sharing it over a huge number of estates, whereas the up and comer is trying to project their kind of wearing the clothes for the job they want kind of thing. So yeah.
Any more? Gosh, it must have been a thorough talk, mustn't it? Thank you very much. Can I now ask